Good morning. This is Sarah Rose Solly, and you're listening to the Barbie Trauma Podcast. Our main goal is to share conversations that will help end the stigma surrounding mental health and trauma. Each episode, I aim to share what I've learned on my own healing journey, and also through starting a nonprofit that serves survivors of physical and sexual violence. Though some of these topics may be heavy, we vow to approach this conversation differently and more authentically than you've ever heard it before. We're here to advocate for women, education, and mental health, while also embracing the art of comedy and powerful healing vibrations of laughter. In other words, we try to not take ourselves too seriously. Welcome back to part 2 with Dr. Kari Leavell as we continue our discussion on the different types of sexual predators. We also dive into prevention education, what's been proven to work and what doesn't.
And so when you think about that in relation to the idea of an opportunistic perpetrator versus the other categories, if we can aim at educating this group, perhaps we can prevent and help them understand that what might seem like a harmless opportunity may be a grave, life-changing experience for someone. And it may prevent them from developing a desensitization towards human suffering or human pain to recapitulating that violence to other people or escalating to even more vulnerable people. All people who survive sexual violence are vulnerable in their respective experiences. We want someone to learn about it before they do it, and that's what primary prevention is. So does prevention to children work? Again, let's not use the word prevention. It's secondary prevention. It's education. It's helping them understand what is right and what is wrong. And I do think that is important, and it has its place, especially for kids who do have a safe person in their lives who isn't hurting them in some way. But it does, I think, miss some of the kids who may have heard the programs that I provided. It was a puppet show. It was cute. It was funny. They giggled, right? But I might imagine in hindsight that it was also very confusing when I might name off, you could talk to your teacher or your parent or your grandparent when any one of those people may have been who was hurting. I think that the prevention efforts really need to be aimed at the people who are more likely to commit the violence.
There's so much to unpack here. I think this is the stuff that really just fuels my heart, like the fire in my heart with this fight. And to start with, prevention education is complicated. It's
Mhm.
so complicated. As you mentioned, there's several different training methods, and then
Mhm.
there's the options of who you're educating and why. And do you
Mhm.
start with the children? Do you start with the parents? Do you start on the college campuses? And with the children, as much as like part of me still just wants to go directly to the kids, save the children, like even if it helps 1 out of 1,000 just by giving them some of these terms. I don't, it's difficult because they're the most at risk, they're the most vulnerable, they have the highest abuse statistics. But it should not be their responsibility at that age, when in most cases, and it's going to be an adult and a quote unquote someone who should be a safe adult in their life, doing the harm. And
Right.
B, statistically speaking, I believe too, by the time they're in school and getting this prevention education, most of them have already been abused. I don't know. Sometimes it just feels like an uphill battle. And
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I remember feeling that like that at the time because the lowest age of kids that I spoke to were, I think, maybe pre-K. This was about a 20 or 30-minute puppet show. That's even beyond their attention span, right? But at even age 4 and 5, they're likely already being manipulated toward abuse if the abuse hasn't happened or the abuse has already begun. And it
Mhm.
isn't uncommon. It isn't uncommon. It isn't always, but it isn't uncommon that abuse may slow down or stop as a person reaches adolescence, particularly when menses begin for girls or when young boys begin developing more strength.
And isn't it true as well when a child or possibly anyone is traumatized and harmed by someone that they know, that their trauma response is going to be less likely the fight or flight? They're more likely to go into the freeze and fawn mode.
Correct. So when we think about, let's think about it, even let's zoom out a little bit, because when we think about what we teach children, respect your elders. If a grown-up is talking to you, answer them. I don't know about in your family, but I know that in my family there was sort of like you hugged relatives when you saw them, even if you don't really know them. There's a polite culture when we teach children that they need to engage any kind of touch with somebody that they don't know. That's a mixed message from somebody shouldn't touch you in these places. You listen to what your elders say, and someone says, don't tell anybody about this, even if abuse hasn't started, but the grooming, or what I like to call manipulation, it begins. Grooming is associated with hygiene, and that's a good thing. Let's call it what it is. It's manipulation. Hey, let's just keep this between you and me. It feels fun and exciting and special. So children are socialized to obey and to listen and to trust and to touch. And so they're not taught to discern those things.
When prevention education can feel like, even though it is so needed, it can feel like such an uphill battle. You brought up something that might be even a better solution.
So we talked about many things, including teaching people about the long-term impact of abuse and sexual trauma on a person's ability to thrive in the world. It sets up their brain to be different than the average brain of a peer who hasn't experienced abuse. One of the examples that I thought of after we talked was, I think there were a handful of times in which I gave a program to a group of fraternity people, men, and I discussed the rape exam, the forensic exam that's done to collect forensic evidence. And the looks on some of their faces were horror and shock to understand what people go through in order to have a chance that their case gets any kind of justice served. The people who are most likely to become a perpetrator are the ones who need to hear messages about how not to abuse people. And kids need to be taught things, but it isn't their responsibility. It's the parents or the adults to protect them. And so there's a lot of important education, I think, to parents through, let's say, example, a PTA or some other mandated group, that when you notice changes in your kid, you need to investigate it. There is an explanation. Children are not that complicated. We get complicated as adults because the world makes us complicated. And so when there are discrepancies or unexplained shifts or developments that are out of sync with what's normal or expected genetically and general development, those are things that parents need to key in on. Not taking nothing as an answer or everything's fine as an answer, because kids are only going to tell people things who they think are going to listen and hear them, who they think are going to be helpful and not reactionary, and that fundamentally they are going to be believed. And so one of the other points of education that I think is important is that if your kid tells you something, believe them, because kids don't make these things up. Something happened. You may not ever be able to know exactly what did, but believing them fares better for their healing and recovery long term. And the folks who I know that I work with who weren't believed or who didn't have anybody to tell, they are in a long-term therapy dynamic, and I get to be that safe adult for them, helping that healing to occur. But it could have been different if somebody had taken an interest in their behavior much sooner. I hope any parent listening kind of really clues into how are you really talking to your kid and asking questions that require more than a one-word answer.
Absolutely. And you also mentioned about if the consequences for the heinous acts
Yes.
were more intense for the perpetrators, that could
Yes.
be a possible, I don't want to say, again, solution's not the right word, but
Right. If there are executed consequences, bear with me here with my language, but that are more costly than the crime, then it may deter people from doing these crimes. And it will deter some, maybe not all, but it will deter some. It's the same reason why people who use Uber or Lyft or other rideshare programs, because there may be, in certain countries especially, maybe not here per se, but in certain countries, the laws against any kind of drunk driving or something of the sort is such that it's zero tolerance. It allows the use of these alternate means of transportation so that people aren't at risk. The same can be true for these kinds of crimes. when people are not held accountable to their behavior, they are being reinforced in doing that behavior again.
I think that is really something to think about. I really love that you mentioned that on your notes. As you know, this is where my passion lies. I love what we do with the Usual Art Specs with the art therapy. It's incredible, but we're also currently exploring adding some type of education prevention program to
Mhm.
help just put even a dent in this huge societal issue. Right now we treat the symptoms of the survivors, the anxiety, the depression, the PTSD, all of the effects, the aftermath, which will always be needed and is always wonderful. But
Mhm.
we're also ready to try to help stop the cause in the first place. Even again,
Mhm.
if we can just make a
Mhm.
teeny difference. I just feel so strongly about this that something has to be done. So I really want to thank you for spending a couple minutes on these issues with us today.
Absolutely. I have hope for it when we think about Mothers Against Drunk Driving and the ways that it did and has continued to change laws, reducing drinking and driving related traffic incidents, as well as, seatbelt campaigns. Those things have shaped our culture here in the States, that I can say, right? And so I am hopeful that these kinds of interventions and trainings and opportunities to be less ignorant will continue to help reduce sexual violence. I have to believe that to keep doing the work.
I feel you on that. 100%. We have to believe that.
This podcast is something that we do for fun. It is not directly associated to my day job, which is founder and executive director of the nonprofit The Usual Art Specs. However, if you would like to donate to our nonprofit, all funds go directly towards providing art therapy and other resources for female survivors of sexual trauma and domestic violence. We greatly appreciate your consideration and support. To donate, please go to www.theusualartspecs.com. You can also find us on Facebook as The Usual Art Specs and Instagram as The Usual Art Specs DFW. Our podcast also has its own Instagram account. To stay up to date on new episodes, follow us at Trauma Barbie Podcast. Bye, Barbie.